Welcome to the second part in our series. I will be showing you how to actually make a two-part plaster mold here. To make your own mold, you will need a model with a center line, pottery plaster number 1 that you buy locally, a container to mix the plaster in, a way to make a box with melamine board or some other sealed wood, and as you'll see me using ceramic tiles. You'll need some petroleum jelly such as Vaseline and any tools that might seem useful to you. Just to let you know, we have the mold in this video that we're making available at ceramicsmokeware.com. So in case you're not sure if you want to go through this whole process of making your own plaster mold, you can at least try an existing plaster mold and slip cast into that to see how you like it. Let's begin.
You can use any kind of clay, it doesn't really matter. You can use the propylene clay. I'm gonna be using this clay, my recycled clay. Just start filling it in. And it doesn't need to be perfect. Don't worry if you're off a little or if it's a little jagged. This is where we're gonna begin to build up the walls. If you're using laminated wood, you can simply screw it, clamp it, screw in attachments to then clamp it. But obviously this is what I'm using, so we're not gonna get into that. Alright, now obviously I have these cracks that need to be sealed, and same with using wood. You may have these little bit of cracks that the plaster can seep down into. Worse off with this, of course. So we'll fill this with the plasticine clay, and as you can see, you know, it's a little jagged here. It's okay, it's not too big of a deal. That's not where you're gonna be having issues. If you're really picky, you can make it a little thinner and just try and be a little more accurate. So we just finished building up the walls of that to make the base plate, and we're gonna use plaster to then pour in there. We're using pottery plaster number 1. That is the one that you're gonna be wanting to use. So the ratio for using pottery plaster number 1 is we're gonna have 10 parts plaster, so I have 10 ounces of plaster in this container, and then I have 7 parts of water in this other container, and we're simply gonna dump it in here, and we're gonna put the water in first. And then you might want to use a respirator. I highly recommend using a respirator when you're working with plaster. I'm going to try and talk to you though and try not make too much dust. So you want to kind of evenly pour it in slowly, and then it's going to start dissolving into the water. And we can do it slowly. We're not in necessarily any rush. And then let it kind of sink into the water. And I probably should use a little more, to be honest with you. You know, you want to mix it within a minute, so I'm going to get just a little more water, mix in a little more. A little more plaster. Because at the end of the day, you want to have, you know, too much plaster rather than not enough. If you have not enough, then you know, you're going to be having some problems. So pour in the rest of that water. It's going to be pretty full now that I'm looking at it. Might transfer it to another container. And then I'm just going to mix it with my glazed tongs. If you're doing a bigger batch, you might want to use your mixer, so your drill and your mixer. Alright, we'll let that sink in slowly. And then we'll hurry and mix that, and then we'll pour it into our mold. So it's kind of chunking up, we need to give it a minute. That's what happens sometimes when you pour big chunks onto the water, so try and do it slowly, whereas I just did it fast at the end. And remember, it's 7 parts water to 10 parts plaster, and if you don't do that, then it's not going to be as strong, it's not going to set as well, and you preferably should have your water at a temperature around 80 degrees Fahrenheit when working with pottery plaster number 1. It just helps it set at a much quicker rate. I'm unfortunately not doing that, just using the outside hose outlet, and it's about probably 60 degrees, 50 degrees, so that is a little bit cold, and it's going to take longer for this to set. So now that we mixed it, I like to try and tap out the air bubbles. Simply just kind of hitting it from below or the side, and you can see the bubbles kind of coming up. And it's ready to pour, so let's move the camera and we're gonna pour it right now. And sometimes, depending on what you're using, you might want to coat that with something like Vaseline and petroleum jelly, but I think we'll be alright. So let's pour this in nice and slow. And like I said, we don't need an incredibly thick layer. I don't want to go higher than my clay model there. So that's a little over, I'm thinking, 1/4 of an inch thick. And that'll make it nice and strong. See these air bubbles coming up? I'm going to hit my table just gently to kind of knock some more of the air bubbles up. But of course I don't want to break my tiles so that the plaster starts pouring out. If you're using wood, it'll be a lot easier to not have any issues. So we're going to let that sit for an hour, 2 hours. Alright, so let's remove this. So you gotta be very careful with this, you know, it's fragile. You know, if you break it, you can probably shove it back together. Let's start cleaning it up the rest of the way. We're gonna see if this fits in. We may have to carve it up. Not a perfect fit. That's where you're gonna want a carving tool. So this is where we're gonna start working from. I don't want to carve too much. You do want it to fit in, but trimming this up a little, and then we'll keep putting it in and seeing where we're at. So let's be honest. This is angled, okay? This piece has a bit of an angle right here. So if we lean it on its side, we can see this is pretty level and straight, but then once we go up here, it's kind of going up. So what we're gonna have to do, now that we're as close as we can possibly get to putting this in, is we're gonna focus on this being level with the rest of the plaster here. And then what we're gonna do is we're gonna build the clay up just a little right here. It'll be a little awkward, but it'll work out really well. Alright, so I'm kind of cheating here. I'm basically filling in clay on the bottom, which if it was easier to work with the plasticine, I would do that, but it's a little difficult. So I'm just fitting that so it stops wobbling on me. Just basically, you know, filling in the clay and holding it on the other side, and then I'll be able to adjust it a little bit easier to get it into place to where I need it to be. I want to fit some clay right here, so that we don't put pressure back onto the pipe. So I want to put it back on there because of course we're going to have to close this back up to pour on the rest of our plaster. So now we'll just kind of gently adjust it. Gently. So I'm a little disappointed with how I have this big lip back here that I'm going to have to fill in versus this pipe that I made a long time ago. I did not have, you know, the angle on it, like the slant. So this would have been a lot easier to follow that line all the way around doing it this way. But the other way, if you did it, you can just build up with clay rather than making the plaster. But the thing with that, then you don't have this nice clean surface to work with. You're gonna have you know, bumpy surface that's kind of rigid. So I'm just gonna try and build all the way around to the line and kind of ease out and transition back into the plaster as smooth and cleanly as I can. Now it's a little unfortunate that I didn't plan ahead and think about this as it was going to occur, but it's also good because now you can prepare for the worst and see what you might have to do yourself. Do consider how you're going to make your pipe, your model, what it's going to look like, the shape of it, just every aspect of it, because you're going to run into this point where you're going to have to try and meet the center line and make it as perfect as possible. And so this is what I ran into. I had to do this whole back side, and you know, it was a bit difficult. To end this off, we're gonna start kind of carving little notches in here so that when we pour the plaster on top of this, it'll have a notch where it can catch and not move all over the place. You want these to be just a relative size, you know, it's up to your mold. Sometimes it's nice to use something like a penny or a quarter, depending on how big you need your hole. Before we pour the plaster on top of it, is we have to essentially seal. It's kind of like making a little layer in between this plaster and the next layer of plaster so that they don't get stuck to one another. And we're just going to simply use a petroleum jelly like Vaseline. Alright, let's start building it up. So now that I've built up the walls, sealed it off, I'm really quickly going to mix up some plaster, about 28 ounces of water and 40 ounces of plaster. And so let's go an inch above that bowl. Alright, let's see how this removes. Easy or not? I don't know. It's not going very easy. Sometimes you should wait. So, look at that. Yes! Beautiful. Perfect. And that's the hard side. That's the side I was worried about. I was like, uh-oh, this might not work. Okay. Just had to pry it up right here. Whoop. You know, I was using my, it kind of hurt, but whatever. So slippery still. Beautiful. Couldn't ask for more.